Good morning, friends. Today it's chilly, beautiful day. Sky's a little bit hazy. Last night I was walking outside in the late, crisp September air, and it was the first night I could actually see my breath. So it's that indicator that winter is steadily on the way as it progressively gets colder. Today it's October 1st, so today's kind of that real first fall day. October is sort of the definitive month in terms of what fall is. So we're going to do another request. I have actually a list right here of all the things I have to do. And somebody gave me a request to do something about Asia, just very broad category. What is Asia bringing for us in terms of commerce into the future? Particularly if we're going to be looking at the three main powerful Asian countries, which are Japan, China, and South Korea, and maybe North Korea if the war there seems to end, which may or may not happen. It's hard to say at this point. I will say probably at this point, China is probably going to be the most powerful country at some point in the future. It's already kind of there already. I would argue it's a lot more powerful than the US just in terms of the output and economic growth that they are experiencing. Also, just their population size is immense, and they just have a knack on pretty much everything. Having said that, they do have a lot of issues, particularly. First of all, they have a lot of pollution issues. There's this pig virus that's going around, and I feel like those kinds of things are going to be repeating themselves in that country. There's going to get to a point where there's going to be some problems in terms of their manufacturing, which generally happens to a lot of countries that are on the edge of becoming a first world nation. Right, they're becoming very economically prosperous. You go to Shanghai, it's basically a metropolis. Most of China, it's become very, it's almost like a first world. There's no real big difference between China or somewhere in the US or somewhere in Europe. Obviously, there are some differences depending on where you go in more rural areas. Housing's definitely a lot different. It's definitely a lot more cramped because of the population size. And also the form of government is a lot more complex. It still has the communist roots that are heavily embedded into it. But overall, though, the standard of living there has changed dramatically. Talking about Japan, South Korea. Japan, I'm not that familiar with, so I don't really have much to say towards it. They've basically been on a plateau for the past 20 or so years. From my observations, they haven't really pushed the boundaries or changed much in that time period, at least from my observations. I'm not from there. I wouldn't really know anything. I know that in terms of their big companies like Sony, Nintendo, some others, it's not off the top of my head. They haven't really changed all that much. They've kind of just sort of been very consistent with what their output is. There hasn't been much of a revolution, nothing like what China is going through right now. And I feel like soon China is going to be in the same place as Japan. Now, South Korea, I feel like is changing a lot just in terms of the tech industry. They're one of the leading countries in terms of tech development, in terms of Wi-Fi. Everyone, like they have this thing where having 1 gigabyte of Wi-Fi data for everyone is like a human right. So they're very progressive in terms of tech. Entertainment wise, K-pop is probably one of the most popular forms of entertainment at the moment. And at least in a lot of places in the world, K-pop is definitely very popular, a lot more popular than Chinese pop or Japanese pop for whatever reason. I never really got into K-pop. I don't really know anything about it. I don't know that it exists, and there's a very strong following of it. So I think South Korea is a very it's a kind of an underdog in this scenario. I mean, they're not really an underdog. They're just kind of doing a lot of great things, but they're kind of under the rug. They're not really in the spotlight yet. And I think they're probably next up in terms of becoming a spotlight. And my prediction is that if North Korea ever, North Korea and South Korea ever decide to become a unified nation, that's going to change a lot of things. It's going to become like basically a superpower in terms of industry, because you have North Korea, which has, not a lot of resources. It's a lot very impoverished, but the one thing they do have is a very strong military. Like their army is insanely disciplined. They have a lot of performers, a lot of people who are just very rigidly trained in whatever they do. Now, in terms of actual innovation and creativity, they're sort of stifled in that area because it's very much focused on serving towards the higher power, which is at the time Kim Jong-un. But if they, meet up with South Korea with their innovation and their creative output and their, if you mix all those North Korean dancers and those big entertainment spectacles or whatever, and you mix that with the K-pop aspect, it'll be insane. And if you have, these people who are trained very specifically, let's say just like in coding or mathematics, and then they team up with the highest developers in the tech industry, it's going to be like this huge synthesis of two completely different cultures. And I think it'll be very groundbreaking, and they'll eventually just become a powerhouse. Once or if they ever decide to join together. But if we're going to look at other parts of Asia, which Asia is a big continent, right? We're looking at Southeast Asia, and that's a place that's still like a very developing part of the world. I see a lot of manufacturers going in there, and that's changing up that whole world, basically. I mean, those places were affected by communism later than China was, and so they're sort of a little bit behind in terms of the development that China's going through. But I feel like it's going to be rapid. It's going to be a rapid change for them once it becomes a lot more developed and a lot more industrialized, which people will argue is a bad thing or it's a good thing. It doesn't really matter. It's just so long that there will be a progress in terms of the human development there. If we were looking at like places like Cambodia, for instance, which were their culture and cities were basically destroyed by the Khmer Rouge during the 1970s, and now they're sort of having a revival of this, a lot of industrial interests that are happening there. So it's developing quite fast, and that's probably what's going to make it rise to a more level like what China is or Japan is or South Korea is now, which might take at least like 20 or 30 years before it gets to that level, which really isn't that long of a time. And you have countries like Singapore, which are basically like they're already there. They're probably at like the top in terms of like best places to live at the moment, most sustainable economies, even though they have a lot of problems with their government in terms of like you can't spit on the sidewalk, which is a very it's pretty strict in terms of what you can and can't do there. But in terms of livability and economic prosperity, they're basically at the top right now. And it's just like this huge network of commerce that they have going on there, which is pretty interesting. If we're going to look at India, I don't know much about. I'm going to be honest. I know that they have a lot of problems with their government, and their industrial pursuits are pretty flawed in terms of what they're going through, right? I mean, they have a pretty flawed government, as it seems. There's obviously some third-party interests that are manufacturing there, and that's when you get like that corporation funding the government, and the government just kind of keeps all the money and doesn't really give it to anyone else, and that causes a huge problem in terms of poverty. And this is happening in Africa. It's happening in Arabic countries as well. And it's we say like industrialization can be a good thing, but this is an instance where it's very destructive because it's not happening within their own interests, right? It's happening on third party. It's third party corporations coming in. At least this is what I'm like observing. I really don't know anything about what India's economic situation is like. I do know that it's obviously very flawed in terms of its development, and there's a huge poverty gap, or whatever you want to call it. So anyway, those are my thoughts, and I hope you have a wonderful day.